you all for allowing me to share my specific story with you all. It begins back in October of 2001. At that time, I was assigned to 3rd Range Battalion in Fort Benning, Georgia, and shortly after the events of 9/11, we were alerted to begin planning and preparing for the initial military operations into Afghanistan in response to the attacks on American soil. Now, at that time, we were well-trained, well-equipped, and a well-disciplined force. We spent countless hours out in the range conducting marksmanship training. We worked with demolitions and explosives all the time. We practiced infiltration techniques to get into enemy territory, including dropping from a perfectly good airplane at a low level in the middle of the night just to get into where the enemy was at. Now, with all that experience and training, we didn't have combat experience. We were a relatively green force. What I mean by that is our senior leaders, our officers and our senior non-commissioned officers had combat experience in either Desert Storm or Panama or Somalia. But the majority of our organization had not deployed to combat yet, so it was very green. I assure you that 14 years later, the majority of that battalion is now very combat experienced and has multiple deployments underneath its belt. Now, we deployed forward once we were told to go forward into the Middle East, and the majority of our organization staged out of a land base. But a few of us deployed forward onto the USS Kitty Hawk, which is United States Navy aircraft carrier, kind of a duck out of water, so to speak. Okay, and what you see on the deck is a number of high-tech, multi-million-dollar aircraft normally launched from that platform, conduct precision strikes in return. But for this particular operation, they dispersed all those aircraft throughout the region and replaced them with Army helicopters sitting on top of that deck and underneath, instead of sailors who had folks like myself who were members of the Special Operations Task Force. And at that time, we continued planning and preparing for operations, waiting for the approvals to go into Afghanistan. And those soon came. And on 19 October, we rose out of the flight deck, up onto the flight deck, and prepared to board those helicopters for the initial military operations into the southern part of Afghanistan. Now, at that time, we also brought in our leaders, right before we boarded the helos, and conducted a leaders' last-minute check. What has changed since we last planned this operation? And I turned to my intelligence officer and asked him, has the enemy situation changed? And he assured me it had not since our last update on the previous 12 hours. What he did tell me is that CNN had just reported that United States military aircraft were leaving USS Kitty Hawk en route to Afghanistan. And what that provided was early warning for anybody who intended to harm to us, disrupt our operations from the time we departed that aircraft carrier until our intended target. So the intelligence officer who told me that was not actually going on this mission, so he smiled, gave me a thumbs up, and said, good luck. Now, for my small group, we took about 45 individuals on my mission with about 4 aircraft. We would deploy off the aircraft as a reserve task force. We would move into a position in Pakistan on a desert landing strip and await to be called forth with others who are operating inside Afghanistan, should they need assistance when and if required. And so we'd sit in Pakistan and wait for that call forward. It was just adjacent to the border, so we had a quick reaction time. So we boarded our helos and boarded the flight deck, and actually departed and went over water. Our flights over water was without incident. And we went from feet wet to feet dry, which is a condition where you're flying over water to flying over land. We entered the country of Pakistan, flying over that airspace, and immediately began to receive ineffective fire from below. Now, the country of Pakistan had agreed with the coalition, was supporting our coalition. But not every Pakistani citizen got that message, and they began to fire up in the air because they didn't quite understand why the infidel had arrived to attack Pakistan. In fact, that was not the case. But you can't prevent all those situations from occurring. It was ineffective. We continued on with our mission and drove on to what was the desert landing strip. As we began to arrive at our destination, we began to slow and descend. When you do that, the rotor wash that is pushed downward from these aircraft stirs up a tremendous amount of dust and debris from whatever on the surface of the ground. In this particular case, what you end up with is a thing called brownout. As we descended, that dust and debris begins to come up and it consumes the aircraft, the atmosphere of the air. And in this particular case, the pilots lost visual acuity of anything that's outside of the aircraft. They do have protocols, they're very well trained, and they switch their instruments and right in front of them to make sure they still had a safe flight, keeping distance from the aircraft in front of them or any obstacles that are in the air. Now, in this particular instance, the landing strip we were going to had about 3 to 4 inches of fine, almost like talcum powder. So I'm walking on the moon. When you step, you can see it burst out from your foot. With that in the air, it began to seep in through every crevice and hole in that aircraft. And pretty soon, the inside of the cockpit looked exactly like the outside of the cockpit. It was completely browned out. They lost visual acuity of instruments that were 2 to 3 feet in front of them. Very dangerous situation. So how do they handle this? They are trained for it. They immediately come to a hover. They communicate to each other. And they begin to land. We landed rather abruptly, safely though. And my Rangers dispersed from our aircraft and now ordered security at a perimeter position to guard the aircraft. I came up on our communication networks, talked to the other members who were on the ground of the aircraft that landed in front of me, and then our element picked up and began to move forward to link up with those elements. This is about the time I discovered that the aircraft in front of me had not had such a safe landing. Came upon the third aircraft on our flight of 4, and it was on its side. What had happened is that aircraft had also come to hover, and as it began to descend, it began to drift laterally with such force and speed that when it touched ground, the momentum carried it over onto its side, and unfortunately trapped 2 of our Rangers underneath it. When I came upon the scene was our Rangers and our crew from the aircraft trying to free those 2 individuals from underneath that heavy aircraft. Now, despite the heroic efforts and the best medical service you can provide in austere conditions such as this, we were not able to save those 2 Rangers. And in fact, America had just suffered its first killed in action in the global war of terrorism out of this desert landing strip because of the hazardous conditions, not necessarily from enemy fire. Now, you have to understand at that point, instead of being in a position as a reserve to go help others, it turns inward to a rescue and recovery yourself. We spent the majority of that night and the next morning recovering our own individuals and our own equipment back to the ship, believe it or not, to continue planning and preparation for the next set of operations. One thing I want to share with you is that war is a human endeavor. Decisions by our senior leadership in our nation to protect our nation, unfortunately through history, has resulted in the loss of life of our men and women that we send into combat. We accept that. That's what we sign up for. I'd rather do that than have my son or daughter go out and have to do that 20 years from now. The things we need to realize is the technology and innovation out there that can help these types of missions. And it's available, and we continue to work on that. This is a very difficult problem. We still continue to work on flight and desert operations because of the brownout conditions, or from flying in snow, whiteout conditions, or rain, or smog, or dust, anything that you can think of. The one thing I'd like to say is that despite our best intentions, despite the strength of our plan, the thoroughness of our preparation for this mission, and the belief in the justification of what we were doing, military operations, combat operations, sometimes have unexpected results. And those unexpected results can be quite humbling. Thank you for allowing me to share my story with you.
Questions for Lee? You mentioned brownout, and you must be doing something in that area to help.
Absolutely right. That has existed for a long time with our Hilo aircraft. And actually, in 2009, because of the loss we had either in Iraq or in Afghanistan, a task force came across from all of the DoD and actually reached out to other communities of interest, bring them in from industry, where we can think of to try to solve this problem. We've still been trying to solve that problem. We have some good plans in place. The Army has a 3-pronged approach to this through sensors, cueing, and flight instrumentation. Kind of help share the workload of what's being done in that aircraft, pass off some of those more mundane tasks to the aircraft with autonomy, and allow the human to focus on those things that a human should focus on. How do I keep distance? How do I remain safe? Where is the decision being made to place this aircraft on the ground? Here at DARPA, we have a couple programs that contribute to some of those things across the services. We have Alias program and TTO. That's a drop-in automation program or component that goes inside a helicopter or a fixed-wing aircraft that can go with some of those energy management, some of those more mundane functions that can switch, or a machine can handle those things to allow the human to focus on those things that a human should be in charge of. We also have multifunctional RF with Mr. Bruce Wallace here in DARPA. What he's working for is a better sensor. We'll get across this dust these different debris forms that may be out there, to be able to give us visual acuity through those things. And in the past, we've tried to mitigate these effects on the battlefield. How do we keep our forces safe? How do we minimally operate? If you think about it, some of the things we're doing now are trying to turn this into a tactical advantage. But certainly the enemy can't operate in these conditions, so maybe we should. And if we use our technology, we can actually go out and create conditions where we can take advantage of this and actually launch into conditions like this because the enemy can't. And will put us in a place where he's at a disadvantage because he isn't overcome. That would be a huge, huge win for us.
Well, where do you think the Army is with unmanned systems, especially in the air?
Sure, huge proliferation with unmanned systems. On the ground as well, we'll talk about the air. The Army's working on anything from a small unit, a squad of about 9 men, being able to pull something out of his rucksack and throw it into the air, and be able to manage that for very short distances, be able to look in and around in the immediate area. What that does is expands their situational awareness from where they can visually see to maybe just a few hundred meters beyond it. But in that few hundred meters that you gain, it gives you valuable time so that you can make a decision before the enemy does. Maybe the decision is not to engage and you want to divert and go around it. Maybe the decision is I want to sit up on the hilltop because it gives me such a great advantage if we end up firing each other. Those are the small things that are happening on the ground. At a larger level, we're looking at the Great Eagle, which is a larger system that will help more of our senior leadership operate in the Army and gain advantage for them. It's on the scale of a Predator, like you might see in the Air Force. It gives the Army that capability. And what that does for the Air Force, it frees them to go after more strategic targets and place those aircraft in a greater distance run on high-value targets.